Well, kia ora and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming, as it were, to today's English and Linguistics program seminar. I'm Paul Tankard and I convene these events. Today, we welcome as our speaker, MA candidate in English, Chris Lamb, who I'm pleased to see here, and whose dissertation is being supervised by Associate Professor Dave Chicarico. Chris is working on simulated weirdness using literary texts, but also video games. Chris, when you're ready, you're welcome, well, almost ready. You're welcome to start, but everybody else, could I ask you please to render yourselves mute until you're instructed otherwise. After Chris has finished his presentation, there'll be time for questions. You can chat if you like at the side. Those sorts of activities will be supervised by my co-pilot, Beth Chapman. So, Chris, when you're ready, you can get underway, and we welcome you. Thanks very much.
Thanks for the introduction. So, are my slides showing up, Paul?
Yes, they are, Chris.
Okay, cool. Hello, fellow Zoomers. So I want to begin with a confession. For most of my life, I didn't care for horror. I hated how formulaic it was, how its tropes punched down on the neurodivergent, the disabled, and the poor. Yet when movies like The Witch, Get Out, Annihilation, and Midsummer started appearing, I began to realize how much emancipatory power horror stories could contain, how horror could grapple with complex issues of gender and race, as well as concepts like colonial mentality, post-humanism, and complex PTSD. At the same time this was going on, I began reading weird fiction, a late 19th century development on Gothic and pulp fiction that featured sentient trees, infinite staircases, demonic catgirls, and cosmic deities, things we now take for granted in fantasy and science fiction. I saw that here too, new developments were taking place, where the reactionary stories of H.P. Lovecraft and Robert E. Howard were being contested by 21st century figures like Guillermo del Toro, China Miéville, and Jeff Vandermeer. The monstrous other, so abused by earlier writers, was given empathy by these new figures, and in this transformative move, monstrosity itself was shifted to the structures that designate what is monstrous in the first place. That which was monstrous became a system of power capable of reducing certain peoples into mere things. I'm going to go through 3 case studies in this talk to try and depict this thematic shift in weird fiction. I'll also explore, in my last case study, the weird in video games, which operates through a semiotics of simulation on top of representation. So William Hope Hodgson is a weird fiction author who's fascinated me for years because so many of his scenarios have been adapted into video games, despite his relative obscurity from video game discourses. In his novel, The House on the Borderlands, published in 1908, pigmen besiege a house owned by a man referred to as the Recluse. The Recluse defends his house round after round with traps and a shotgun. This is a near mirror image of the horde and siege modes in shooters such as Call of Duty and Rainbow Six, where players must defend a set location, erecting barricades, setting up traps, and upgrading their equipment. In Hodgson's story, The Voice in the Night, fungi infect and assimilate human beings, altering their bodies and desires. This narrative is similarly taken up and reworked by The Last of Us, whose zombified enemies are puppeted by a mutant strain of cordyceps, a parasitic fungus. Across these examples is a recurring theme of invasion, whether that of the home or the body, a theme that produces in the characters affected a desperate need to police their boundaries. The weird fiction scholar Jonathan Newell understands Hodgson's The Voice in the Night as a depiction of reverse colonization, where the white male imperialist of Robinson Crusoe's time finds himself against not a passive environment to be made productive by his will, but rather an active environment that drags them inescapably into an entanglement of alien matter and forces. Neil suggests that weird fictions from the 19th and 20th century depict the colonial fragility of subjects who have come to realize their own porous boundaries as physical, cultural, and political beings. This process begins slowly in The Voice in the Night. The framed narrator and his fiancée are shipwrecked on an unknown island, which is covered in fungal growths. They set on a ship further inland and scour its deck of fungi. No matter how hard they try, however, the fungi returns each day, creeping further and further towards them. It colonizes their bodies. They begin to hunger for the fungi, and eventually they consume it. By the end, the narrator realizes that the fungal growths they'd previously encountered had been other shipwrecked humans, that no matter what fungi they eat, they are cannibalizing themselves. The story is noteworthy because its antagonist cannot be anthropomorphized. Its antagonism runs deeper and stranger than the mimicry of pigmen, whose chimeric bodies and behaviors are recognizably human, even if such bodies and behaviors are denied human treatment. The pigmen of the House in the Borderlands may be considered, in China Mayville's terms, a continuation of the folk monstrosities in Gothic fiction. The fungi of The Voice in the Night are decidedly weirder, a categorical aberration that cannot be understood as plant, animal, or bacteria, and whose aberrant status would not be resolved until 1969 by the ecologist Robert Whittaker, half a century after The Voice in the Night's publication. For Neil, this categorical aberration is metaphysical, transgressing the border between life and death. The fungi are described through signifiers of sickness, as grey and patchy, forming nodules like a skin disease on both the landscape and the human body. Its liveliness is coupled with its capacity to decay. This depiction of life signals towards an increasingly ecological understanding of the world, of life as circuits of material transformation, where discrete designations of active and passive subject are no longer useful. All life is active towards different things for different purposes. What is horrifying in The Voice in the Night is the realization that one could become mere matter for another subject, once believed to be nothing but matter, that human supremacy could be undone so easily in the face of ecological facticity. Something strange happens here, where reverse colonization is by a force that cannot speak, that moves unseen, and that bears no ill will towards its colonized subjects. The fungus is an anti-civilizing force, pre-symbolic and incapable of political articulation. It cannot even recognize the violence of the other, growing back after every scouring, because that's simply its nature. Furthermore, it ignores the ontological boundaries that the narrator constructs between ground, ship, and flesh, consuming everything without discrimination. It is wholly alien, neither less than nor more than human, simply not human. I want to now move to Thomas Desch, a neo-wave science fiction author who came into prominence with his novel The Genocides. Released in 1965 during the rise of the environmental movement, The Genocides is part weird, Southern Gothic, post-apocalyptic, and science fiction, depicting the last days of a human group who must survive in the wake of an alien colonization that's devastated the Earth's ecosystem. This blurring of genre boundaries was typical of neo-wave science fiction, which operated with the pulp freneticism of weird fiction, smashing together modernist, psychedelic, and speculative elements to produce texts that shared more in common with Franz Kafka than John W. Campbell. Thomas Desch himself has said that his works were an attempt to contest the imperialism implicit in hard sci-fi's technocratic heroes. The Genocides also depicts reverse colonization, a theme that the science fiction scholar Rob Latham traces back to H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds. Where Desch and Wells' stories differ from Hodgson's is in their depiction of human extinction through human means. The violence and subjugation of colonialism turned back on the colonizers themselves, a process the French poet Aimé Césaire called fascism. Though the aliens in War of the Worlds are not literally human, their motives are. They invade Earth because they've depleted the resources on their own planet. Wells presents the aliens as a mirror image of ourselves, technologically brilliant, yet ecologically inept. This ineptitude, however, leads to their deaths. They are decimated by germs. Humankind wins, but to no skill of its own. Things are worse than the genocides. Earth has already been conquered and transformed into an agricultural colony by aliens. Humans are nearing extinction. Most other species have already died out due to the alien monocrop that has irreversibly altered Earth's ecosystem. As the story progresses, automated drones slowly and methodically hunt down the remaining humans. The genocides ends with the onset of a severe winter and hints that this is the last any endemic species on Earth will see. Throughout the novel, the narrator speculates that humans must be nothing more than pests in a crop field, and that their extermination is likely accomplished by bored functionaries. What's horrifying in these statements is the thought that a sentient being could reduce another sentient being to non-sentience, or phrased differently, that a sentient being could reduce themselves to non-sentience, to the mindless processing of life into things. Whereas the fungi and the voice in the night were terrifying in their mindlessness, the aliens and the genocides are terrifying because they choose to be mindless. Earth and its inhabitants are beneath their regard, a sight for crop yields and nothing more. What Dish does in the genocides is show that Max Weber's iron cage is populated by Hannah Arendt's little Eichmanns, that the murder of the Earth's inhabitants is nothing but a utilitarian calculation by aliens who, in seeing the world through the lens of productivity, become blind to their complicity in genocide. In fact, they must become blind to their complicity, for if they aren't productive enough, they will fail as workers and capitalists. They'll either be fired or go bankrupt. To rephrase my initial statement then, the iron cage of the market creates little Eichmanns, people who are compelled by economic precarity towards political compliance. Where Wells sees the origin of colonization in scarcity, Dish sees its origin in surplus, and the artificial need created by the free market for capitalist competition, leading to an increasingly meaningless system divorced from material needs. This meaninglessness is reinforced by the absence of aliens in the genocides. Not once does any character see their colonizer. They are wholly other apart from the world, despite their effects on the world. The structural inequality mirrors climate change in our world, where the majority of those who suffer its consequences will never come into contact with those at its source. The aliens in the genocides kill humans through ecological imperialism, the destruction of ecosystems that once afforded subsistence, shelter, and warmth. Only when humans persist despite these adverse conditions do the aliens send in drones. The consideration of human life is an afterthought, only arising when humans prove themselves to be a particularly resilient species. I see two moves happening here, between Hodgson and Dish, and between Wells and Dish. The first move is a politicization of the weird. While Hodgson's fungal antagonist breathes life back into a nature emptied by Enlightenment economic theories, this lively encounter remains an isolated event in an unknown island in an uncharted sea. Dish, however, shows how one's encounter with foreign species are driven by geopolitical events, that nature is always prefigured by history. The second move, from Wells to Dish, is a reconceptualization of capitalism, from industrial capitalism to consumer capitalism. No longer do we live in a world of scarcity, but one of overproduction. Yet the profit motive remains unchanged, and this motive leads to systemic barbarism, the transformation of all living beings into mere things. Like Hodgson's fungi, Dish's capitalism cannot recognize its own effects, creeping over entire planets until they're desolated. My last example is a video game, which cannot be analyzed the same way as print media. The game studies scholar Gonzalo Frasca states that while all media rely on representations, the representations in books and films are fixed, having been authored, edited, and published in the past. While books and films may be actively interpreted, their contents cannot change. Video games, however, operate through simulation as well as representation. They are actively played, containing a set of rules that permits the generation of new signs, or at least a new sequence of signs. Things change with each playthrough, because even if certain story trajectories are fixed by their past authorship, the player nonetheless traverses, enacts, and contests these moments in the present. With this in mind, I'll move to my last example. Pathologic 2 is a game developed by Ice Pick Lodge and released in 2019, a year before the COVID pandemic. In it, the player controls a character called the Haruspix, who after returning to his hometown in the Eurasian steppe, finds himself at a 0 point of an outbreak. The Haruspix is tasked with discovering the origin of the plague, as well as a cure for it before the town is destroyed. Pathologic 2 is an excruciating experience. As a survival horror, the player must manage health, immunity, exhaustion, hunger, and thirst. These stats increase and decrease through various interactions. Health decreases through combat, starvation, and infection, and it can be regained through bandages, painkillers, and sleep. Immunity is lowered by entering plague districts, rummaging through containers, and coming into contact with the infected. If immunity falls completely, the Haruspix becomes infected himself, slowly losing health over time. He will also become the target of violence by vigilantes and soldiers attempting to stop the spread of the plague. Hunger drops with the passing of time and must be constantly replenished with food. Much of this food, however, causes thirst, leading to an ever-shrinking stamina bar. Exhaustion is linked to sleep, something that becomes harder and harder to justify as more tasks pile onto the player's shoulders. They may choose to drink coffee instead and sacrifice health. These 5 simple stats weave together a complex web of feedback and feed-forward loops. I might need to run to the town hall to meet someone, but having secured no food the previous night, I have to ransack a plague district. If my protective clothing hasn't been repaired recently, it may wear through, compromising my immunity. If I find food and eat it, I'll become thirsty, limiting the distance I can run. If I then encounter a bandit, he may catch up to me and hurt me. By the time I reach the town hall then, I'll have worse health, immunity, exhaustion, and thirst, but my hunger will be sated. This is maybe a 20-minute sequence in a 30-hour game, and this is just the initial state of things. Every day, the world of Pathologic 2 changes. When the outbreak occurs on day 3, the price of food triples from its initial cost. When an inquisitor from the capital arrives on day 7, money becomes worthless for buying food. Instead, you have to use food coupons. Every day you have to learn the world anew. So I've touched on ecological and colonial horror in my previous examples. I want to now consider cosmic horror, which can roughly be understood as the meaninglessness of one's struggles in a system too large to affect or comprehend. Such themes can be found in the writings of Kafka and Vonnegut, as well as lesser-known figures like Anna Kavan. Pathologic 2 isn't the first game to incorporate cosmic horror. In Dark Souls, a game released in 2011, feelings of futility are generated through the player character's death, which comes fast, frequently, and some would argue unfairly. This gameplay complements its Gothic architectures, monsters, and themes, which draw on cosmic horror depictions of decadence and degeneration. Both The Voice in the Night and the Genocides share this lineage. In The Voice in the Night, the narrator and his fiancée regress into a fungal existence. In the Genocides, humans are reduced to parasites amidst alien crops. Both stories depict a resignation over a world already lost. Though the Genocides politicizes cosmic horror, depicting colonization as an incomprehensible trauma, it depicts no contestation of this condition. Its characters and the earth they inhabit are, for intents and purposes, already dead. Pathologic 2, however, is not entirely bleak. While each day introduces new and punishing challenges, Each day also rewards the player with greater narrative comprehension, intriguing snippets about the town's ruling families, the history of the steppe and its indigenous people, kin, and ultimately the source of the plague. So 60 years before the events of Pathologic 2, the kin were forcibly assimilated by the Oginskis, a family of industrial capitalists that needed a workforce for their new slaughterhouse. The slaughterhouse was built atop a temple where the kin once sacrificed bulls. The introduction of industrial slaughter turned this small flow of blood into a torrent, soaking the land beneath the town. The Oginskis also relocated the kin from their original settlements into the termitary, a complex of high-density apartments and factories located beside the slaughterhouse. It's at this interface between industrial slaughter and overcrowding that the plague begins. 60 years later, when the Haruspex enters the town, the termitary is sealed by the Oginskis to stop a workers' strike, the first in 60 years. By the time it's opened in day 7, over 7,000 workers will have died from plague, starvation, and rioting. I struggle to articulate how much pain this game causes me, because while I want to say that Pathologic 2 was prescient for its time, predicting COVID-19's effects on indigenous, racialized, and working class communities, I can't, because these issues are not new. In 1905, Upton St. Clair published The Jungle, a novel that depicts the violent exploitation of Black and migrant slaughterhouse workers in Chicago. In 1911, 146 predominantly women workers burned to death in a New York sweatshop because the doors leading to the street were locked to prevent breaks without supervision. A century later, in 2012, 124 workers in Dhaka died the same way. These events keep happening because the conditions that breed them haven't disappeared. They've merely been displaced to poorer nations and peoples. Through phylogenetic analyses, we now know that HIV originated from the Belgian Congo during the 1920s, a time of brutal industrialization. To feed the new densely concentrated workforce, monkeys and apes were slaughtered in numbers previously unheard of, drenching the land in blood. A century later, in 2020, COVID swept across the world. While COVID's origins will be debated for decades, its zero point was in Wuhan, a city that has also undergone rapid industrialization and population growth. There are few games that engender such a feeling of political rage in me. They go beyond the reproduction of genre tropes and vapid ethical dilemmas to instead tap into our histories of colonial, corporate, and authoritarian violence. Pathologic 2 doesn't merely engender the potential for an encounter with disgust. It channels this disgust towards a side of political contestation. All the agony the player has experienced is due to the perverse powers of a capitalist family that treats its workers with disdain. A family who would rather lock up its workers to die than engage with the conditions that engendered their struggles in the first place. Yet despite all the suffering, Pathologic 2 presents the possibility of healing. In one particular narrative path, the Haruspex integrates scientific and indigenous knowledges and comes to understand that the plague is a form of connection through death, a death that reveals the lines of previous histories drawn across geopolitical spaces. He further realizes that a cure for the plague requires a reordering of both the physical body and the communal body, that neither may be considered apart from the other, and that all life is connected through such historical lines. It's here that I see the most exciting aspects of modern weird fiction, which retains the traumatic encounters of its predecessors while going beyond them towards spaces of collective possibility. Where early weird fiction ruptures the identities of its characters, works like Pathologic 2 show how these broken beings may be put back together, never the same as they were, but still alive and yearning for a better world. They show an image of resilience, desperately needed in a time when all things feel upturned and at the same time, endlessly unchanging. They show us a way out that doesn't end in death, even when death is all around us. I would love to develop this point further, but this is all I've written. So thank you for coming to my talk.
Thank you, Chris. And we've got quite a bit of time now to offer Chris thoughts of our own in response to what he's shared with us, and to ask questions that might help him clarify the future directions of this interesting project. So I'll open the, thanks for that, Beth. I'll open the floor for people with questions. If you could either raise your hand using the raised hand icon, or just, if we can actually see you, you can wave. That will probably do just as well to signal your intention to ask a question. So I'll we'll open the floor now.
I'll start. Hi, Chris. Tom McLean here. Thanks for that. I appreciated the clarity and conciseness with which you presented the material. I don't know any of the works that you talked about, though the Hodgson is intriguing to me as a 19th century person. But let me ask you this. I guess my question would be, you did a really nice job of sort of summarizing the key elements of these three texts, but you've got a short story by a British writer from 100 years ago. You've got a science fiction work from an American author from, I guess, the late 20th century, and then you've got a contemporary video game aimed at a global audience. And while I get the big red thread that goes through, I guess I'm struggling a bit to figure out why those works in particular, as opposed to, say, War of the Worlds or whatever, any why those three works across three different genres make sense to talk about together in an MA. Would it be more productive to focus on three works from Hodgson's time, or from Dish's time, or from a contemporary moment?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, because the way my MA is structured is quite different from how this presentation ended up. And so in my MA, like, I'll have 3 chapters, and each kind of looking at different just different historical periods. So in the first one, like, that's where I connect up weird fiction with new wave sci-fi, because new wave sci-fi was like drawing quite a lot on weird fiction as well as hard sci-fi. They're trying to politicize both these different strands. I guess what I was trying to do with this talk was specifically see how, like, concepts of ecology developed across time. So even if, like, these writers do not share a distinct, like we're in contact with one another or whatnot, we're still seeing this, like, slow shift and the slow, like, politicization of ecology.
Thank you.
Hey, sorry, can I ask a question? I can't see how to raise my hand or whatever.
Yeah, go for it.
Cool. So, like, you're talking about the slow shift of like ecological systems as a way of kind of like politicizing stuff like discuss. I just wonder if you link that kind of idea of that process to stuff like, oh, what's her name? Like Sadie Plant, and like her kind of ideas of like the feminine as being something that's self-organizing. And we see that in like machinery, and we see that in systems, and we see that in women. Yeah.
Where does she talk about that? Because I'd really like to know.
It's just a talk that she does. Let me just see if I can find the title. But yeah, I guess just the because it was a talk that was done, I think, in the 90s as well. So it was when there was still this kind of like optimism, I guess, about like, you know, the digital world, and I forget what kind of terms they used to describe the digital world, but it was terms that we don't really use anymore. And like, yeah, this kind of like optimism of the digital space kind of providing this like self-organizing kind of thing that we can see within like systems and within ecology and within the feminine and within women, and like how that can be like politicized, I guess. And so yeah, I just wonder if you have any thoughts on the like that self-organizational piece, I guess.
Yeah, I know there's some interesting works in like anarchist theory that goes into how when you are in a society that doesn't have structures of domination, so overt, like subjugated and dominated, then people don't just fall into like, people don't just laze about and, you know, fall onto the ground and stop working. Instead, they start self-organizing. But yeah, I've never actually read any forms of that theory, like from feminism or from like cyberfeminism.
Okay, yeah. Okay, well, the other question that I had was like you talk about like the politicization of disgust. I wonder like what your thoughts would be on like the commodification of disgust, and like how we can kind of see like politicization as something distinct, or even like something that can challenge commodification. And like, yeah, that return to the body kind of thing, like because when we feel disgust, that's actually something that I feel goes a bit past emotion. It's something that's like a physical bodily response. So yeah.
Yeah, because like you kind of push away. What are some examples of like the commodification of disgust?
Well, this might be like a kind of like weird example or a cliche or something, but in Black Mirror, the series, there was this episode called 10,000 Merits. Have you ever seen that one?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you know how his whole thing is like just being crushed by this like horrific, like totalitarian kind of system, where everything is commodified, and he has like a real visceral, like human rage and disgust against that whole system. And then he you know, gets to a point where he gets a platform where he can finally voice some of these grievances, and the powers that be employ him to basically like, yeah, embody that disgust so that people can consume it. And so yeah, that's like an example of the commodification of disgust, I guess.
Yeah, so like, yeah, kind of like how things that can begin radical become co-opted into like a market, I guess.
Yeah.
I guess the thing is that's gonna happen forever. Like, yeah, like because I do quite like a lot of those works because they show how politics can so easily just slip into an identification with something, or like identifying even an emotion with something like rage, like feeling political rage. But I guess like, because politics is always a struggle, right? So like when these things happen, you have to move beyond that image. You have to keep changing how you represent yourself so you can escape those kind of market forces. And I guess while such a cynical like version of the market exists, like that's going to be a constant threat. I guess what I'm saying is, yeah, like that is a struggle that you have to identify with.
Yeah.
Against,
yeah,
not
no,
with.
yeah, it's interesting because I guess like politicization kind of implies movement. Like it's a call to action. Like if disgust is politicized, then it's like it's asking you to do something with the disgust. Whereas, yeah, I guess commodification of disgust is a bit more like complacent, you know, like you're just
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, like a good example is like how a lot of people don't know that Black Lives Matter was started by like trans and queer Black women. And like over time, like those people that first started it, like they just got, you know, thrown out of the discourse. Like it got picked up and shifted so much. But like they're still working, like they're still doing political work. So like, yeah, I think that's what I have to say, but yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Go for it, Elena, if you want to. Unmute. Hey, so I was thinking with the channel discussed kind of on that road, I thought it was interesting how you pointed out it can give like certain directions to go in, like in response to like kind of cruelty or exploitation. And I was wondering in the game and like in your thoughts on this, was it like kind of the healing part of it, like collectivism and like moving beyond these structures? Like, are there things you could imagine with that, I guess? So, yeah.
Yeah, I guess. Okay, so so my MA is meant to be looking at like these kind of utopian impulses, but I keep having to trace further and further back, and so everything I've been presenting in the past 2 years sounds very like sad and cynical.
I can like see where it's going though. Like
Yeah.
it reminds me of Audre Lorde talking about like understanding things that are really painful, but also giving that like understanding like the arrow that's kind of shot you and like where it's come from and how to use that tool.
It's kind of like well, like a concept that I encountered recently was just the idea of ecological resilience, which is that like a system has a certain amount of like give, it can like bounce back, but then if it gets overloaded, that's when it just is completely destroyed. And that's what, you know, ecological collapse would be. And like I've been thinking about a lot of these games like Pathologic 2 or like Kentucky Route Zero, Disco Elysium, they all seem to be coming from a point of trauma, but going beyond it. And another like thread that I've been noticing is a lot of recent films that have been coming out, like Mother or Men, are still stuck in just pure trauma, and they're all directed by men. And like, so there's a lot of backlash. This is not exactly where we want feminism to be. We've been here for far too long. Like, so yeah, like
Mother as well. Like it didn't really move beyond that at the conclusion.
Yeah,
like,
it just ends up being an eternal, you know, cycle.
Yeah, so would it be like, so do you think it needs to come from other perspectives as well, or like
I think so? Or just like being able to confront pain without being overwhelmed by it. Because like a lot of media that goes into trauma don't really go into the process of healing. Like so many films as well that depict, let's say like lower class like people, and they're just trying to live and bad shit happens and it just ends. And you're just like, what? Like, where is the joy? Where do people move beyond this space? And yeah, like I really want to look at that because like so much of early weird fiction, new wave science fiction, and so forth, they're all very cynical and very pessimistic. And I really enjoy their critiques, but they don't go beyond that. And like a lot of theory is kind of stuck there as well. But unfortunately, yeah, I don't really have an answer for like where we can go right now, but I'm trying to find one, I guess, or trying to see where other people are going with it.
Yeah, at least what you said about like kind of clarifying things so it's not as overwhelming, I think is an important step as well. Just so there is another step, because you can go, oh, what? I don't know if that made sense, but yeah, that's it.
Cool. I've got a question from Adam in the chat, whose mic and video aren't working. So he said, reminds me of the film, I think it's Titan, it's French, right? I'm not sure. The idea of the body, a body being politicized inside an aggressive structure or system. I want to ask about the term weird and the term cosmic horror. I feel like the example of cosmic horror was more specific to the politicization of the body, or body horror. So.
Hold up, let me just reread. Okay, yeah. So in Lovecraft's day, like he's the one who coined the weird fiction as we know it now. Like he he wrote like this big essay called the supernatural fiction and gothic horror or something, and it's where he defines the true weird tale as when a character has a foundation for knowing the world, and then that foundation is like pulled out from under them, and they like lose a way to orient to the world, or they start suspecting that the way they orient does not actually like fit to the world, but they have nothing else to grab onto. So like he's the one who kind of came up with that idea, which then transformed into cosmic horror. And I guess for him, like cosmic horror wasn't so much a bodily feeling, it was like very much an intellectual thing for him. But a lot of more modern examples of like horror, especially from like the 70s, 80s, with like a lot of really pulpy stuff, that starts going into body horror. So that starts going into like bodies that are like transforming, they're coming into contact with other things that transform them. And so that's where a lot of more like modern engagements with the body come from, like with an Annihilation, where like a lot of that is feeling alien from your own body to the point where like someone else takes on your body and literally becomes you. Is there anything more you want to ask? Because I'm not actually sure if I quite answered you.
Tell them a little bit about how you're defining the weird. I think that's a nice way to do it.
Okay, my supervisor has reminded me to, Dave has reminded me to like give a definition for what I consider the weird. So like building on Lovecraft, but also other thinkers who've come after him, like Benjamin Noyes or China Mayville, like it seems like a strong way to define the weird is as fiction that is attempting to like rupture a specific like ideological or logical system of thought. And that can happen through like a lot of different ways. It can be an intellectual encounter, but it can also be something that's deeply bodily felt. Okay, cool.
Are there any more questions for Chris, or maybe I'll pass it to you, Paul?
Okay, thank you, Beth. Well, we've had some interesting suggestions and people wanting to explore Chris's ideas, take them in different directions, give Chris a bit to think about, and some probing questions as well. So, and Chris's presentation was nicely concise, and I think, in fact, very few of us have read the text or are in a position to be especially useful or informative. So I feel there's no point in hanging out for 50 minutes. So unless there's anybody else who's got something they want to ask now, I think we'll just we'll thank Chris for his concise presentation. Wish him well with the ongoing work, and I'll draw the meeting to a close. So thanks very much. Yes, a few claps. Excellent.
Thank you.
Okay.